Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our presenters for doing such nice summaries of their studies. I think these all represent extremely important results for us in the field. So I'll open it up for questions now.
Good morning. It's Michael Smith, MedPage Today. Dr. Wohl, you were very brief about the efficacy and safety results. Oh, look, I'm on. It's Michael Smith, MedPage Today. Dr. Wohl, you were very brief about your safety and efficacy results. But what you seem to be saying to me was there wasn't any difference between the TAF and the TDF. And I'm wondering, in that case, what's the point? Are there differences that are important, in specifically the toxicities?
Right, yeah. No, please let me qualify. I was speaking mostly about the general overall adverse events and not anything specific. Tomorrow there will be a very nice presentation by Paul Sachs about specifically the bone and renal effects of both TDF and TAF in combination with the other drugs that I mentioned. I think that might get at the heart of what you're interested in. But when you look at overall adverse events, the kind of things that we typically report or detect in our clinical trials, there wasn't any difference. And I'm talking about diarrhea, nausea, things like that. But the differentiation, I think, is borne out by what we saw in the phase 2 studies, where we see a cleaner profile in bone and renal effects in that study. But I think it's very important to concentrate as well on the efficacy of TAF, because if it has benefits vis-a-vis its profile as far as bone and renal toxicity, we certainly want to still make sure that it works against HIV. And so my presentation will really focus on the efficacy results of TAF to reassure us that this drug does not have any diminished capacity at all in suppressing HIV.
Just to follow up then, so in renal the renal stuff seen in the earlier trials is borne out in your current trial. Is that that's what you're saying?
I'm saying that's what we're examining specifically as a pre-specified outcome. So in addition to the efficacy, bone and renal outcomes are pre-specified to be examined in the combined analysis. And Paul Sachs will present those tomorrow.
Obviously, we're trying not to break the embargo on data being presented tomorrow. You're trying to get us to, so, but we will point you to that presentation tomorrow morning during the oral abstract session. Yes.
Liz Heileman, HIVandhepatitis.com. I'm wondering also for Dr. Wohl, I know this study didn't address this point, but do you have any speculation based on the distribution of TAF, how it might one day be used as PrEP?
My understanding is that this is a very important question, I think, for the field, and certainly out of the purview of the presentations that you'll hear here at CROI. But my understanding is that this is being aggressively studied by the manufacturer of TAF, Gilead. And so I think you'll hear much more about that in the future.
Hi, Jeff Berry, Positively Aware Magazine. This is for Max. So it gets harder and harder, obviously, to decide to go forward with a compound. So what about the maturation inhibitor, caused BMS to move forward with this? I mean, have you seen anything in terms of resistance in patients that have been studied so far?
Thank you for the question. When we first started development of this compound, we really wanted to solve the issues that plagued the first generation. So our first and primary concern was to make sure that we have efficacy and good viral decay, not only against wild-type GAG virus, but GAG viruses with the baseline polymorphic substitutions that make bevacizumab fail. I believe your question is about emergent resistance. In the proof of concept study, it's premature to discuss emergence because we collected data at several time points, and we have not finished analysis of this data, especially at the higher doses. So it would be premature to answer that question.
Also for Dr. Latea, this is Ed Sussman with MedPage Today. Just I want to make clear, were your studies monotherapy studies, or were they combination
No,
treatment?
this was a proof of concept study. So it's a monotherapy study, yes.
Would you expect that you will be using this in combination with other?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course, HIV is not treated as monotherapy. We will combine it with other ARVs to make a full regimen.
Michael Smith again. Actually, I have another question, and I won't come back to you, Dr. Wall. Dr. Shah, I am trying to get my head around, first of all, two things. I'm assuming that in South Africa, we're still seeing similar rates of morbidity and mortality in your XDR population, that nothing has really improved there particularly. But correct me if I'm wrong. The other question is, so if it's just a transmission issue in high prevalence, high HIV prevalence settings, essentially, is there danger of this spreading widely outside those sorts of settings, as we've sort of worried in the past?
Thanks for your questions. Both of them are very important. So the outcomes for XDR-TB in South Africa have generally not improved. However, there is hope with some of the new TB drugs, particularly bedaquiline, which is being rolled out in South Africa under very controlled circumstances. And some of the early reports we're hearing, these were presented at the International Union meeting in November as a late breaker. Early reports from the first 90 or so patients treated with these drugs are very promising. So I think we're not seeing an overall change in the morbidity and mortality from XDR in South Africa, but I think there's probably good news or improving news in the future. I don't think we'll get to good, but I think there's hope. In terms of your second question about transmission, I think transmission is driving the epidemic in South Africa because of the large vulnerable HIV population there. In terms of other settings where there's a lower prevalence of HIV, I think XDR-TB, MDR-TB, these are diseases that have delays in making the diagnosis and delays in starting treatment. And so I think transmission is still a real concern, even in low HIV prevalence setting. And we've seen that in a number of settings that have conducted similar molecular epidemiology type studies.
And if I could add, Sarita, just one more comment. There's been some speculation that extremely drug-resistant strains of tuberculosis are not as infectious and therefore not as transmissible as drug-susceptible tuberculosis. And I think studies like this very elegant one clearly demonstrate that that's not the case, and that a majority of patients, at least in that setting, acquired their infection through direct transmission of an extremely drug-resistant strain of TB.
Got two more questions. Keith Alcorn, AIDS Map. This is a follow-up question for Dr. Shah. You said in your presentation earlier that around about half of the transmitted cases appeared to be cases of community transmission. Could you say any more about what those community settings were? And the sort of related question, we've been hearing for 7 or 8 years now about the need to improve infection control in healthcare settings in South Africa. Why is that not happening?
Thank you. Those are great questions. I just wanted to clarify the first part of your question. So we have not yet looked at where the transmission is occurring, and so we have collected the data on that and have yet to conduct that analysis. It would be just speculation at this point, but what I can say is that about half of our patients reported that they were hospitalized in the past 5 years before their XDR diagnosis. So I'm extrapolating from there to say that if they weren't hospitalized, they may have most likely acquired their XDR from a community setting. We don't have more information on those community settings, though. To answer your question, we have been talking about infection control since we first really uncovered this XDR epidemic over a decade ago, 2005. I think it was, in fact, it was at the International AIDS Conference. And it has been slow to ramp up, but there has been increased attention to it. I think South Africa is making bold efforts in a number of areas to improve diagnostics, which is part of infection control. It's part of the package of things that needs to be done. So they're improving the time to diagnosis with some of the rapid molecular tests. They are introducing new, maybe more effective, less toxic treatments for XDR-TB, also part of addressing infection control. But some of the big things that need to be done to separate patients, to redesign hospital wards and clinics and waiting areas, those have been slower.
Thank you. I think